You are listening to Influencers from the Conference Board.
Hello, I'm Ivan Pollard, the Marketing and Communications Leader here at the Conference Board. Thank you for tuning in to Influencers, where we're going to be discussing some of the top insights arising from our latest research, sponsored by General Mills, into the attitudes and behaviours of multicultural America. Today, I'm joined by Dana Peterson, the Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and Denise Dahlhoff, the Senior Researcher in the Marketing and Communications Centre. So Denise, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little about this survey?
Sure. So this is part of a series of surveys that we do with US consumers with different ethnic origins. And as Ivan, you just said, the research is made possible by a grant from General Mills. And every time we run this survey, our sample comprises 2,000 US consumers with Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white heritage. And so we run the survey about every half year, and every time we choose a different topic focused. So the last runs were on products. This time we focused on services, and an upcoming survey will focus on more current topics like inflation, energy, activism by corporations, but also by consumers themselves. And so this latest edition on services, the categories we cover there are travel, including some considerations about sustainability, leisure activities, restaurants, healthcare, financial services, education, childcare, pet care, and even fitness. So you see a really wide range of topics. And in terms of the overall findings, the big picture ones are that, of course, age and income are always very important when you think of consumer behavior, but also these racial or ethnic origins are a really important factor we find that are influencing attitudes and behaviors. And so that's really important and valuable input for marketers as they think about their positioning and targeting for their brands. And this ethnic perspective is actually increasingly important as the US is getting more and more diverse every day. Right now, there are only 61.6% of people that are white alone, meaning they don't have any other racial influences. And already now, more than half of all children are people of color. And in addition to some bigger picture findings like reduced business travel and shift to digital workouts, we have lots of details findings on the various services categories that I mentioned.
So Dana, financial services, as Denise said, was one of the topics that we delved into. What were the big insights that you would have our listeners think about?
Sure, Ivan. What was not surprising is that most people do use some form of financial services, namely a bank. But what was rather challenging from the result is that low and middle income Black and Hispanic respondents were generally less likely to use various forms of financial services compared to their Asian and white peers. Meanwhile, they were more likely to state that they use non-traditional or alternative forms of financial services. This might include anything from high interest payday loans to check cashing places to even risky crypto assets. This is important because access to safe and affordable financial services is a vital step towards financial inclusion and also wealth building. And this wealth building supports consumer spending and ultimately US GDP that really benefits all Americans. But even among higher income Black and Hispanic respondents, we found that there were signs that financial services providers still have room to grow in terms of their engagement with these demographics. But the good news is that these data also suggest that there are plenty of opportunities for firms, governments, and also nonprofits to partner on educating and incorporating underrepresented groups into mainstream banking. And that should also help to close racial economic gaps. There are 4 recommendations that we make in terms of opportunities. The first, well, actually 5. So the first is that large financial institutions can definitely partner with and invest in something called community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. And basically, these CDFIs provide access to financial services in underserved communities and also very oftentimes in ethnic minority communities. Many banks are already doing this, but there's certainly still room to grow in that respect. A second recommendation or suggestion is that traditional financial entities can deepen their relationships with multicultural investors, Black and Hispanic, and also Asian investors, through marketing that taps into the different financial goals of these groups. So, for example, our first survey on goods showed that, for example, Hispanic consumers really value buying a home. So, potentially, financial services providers can tap into that zeitgeist within the group. And then a third option is that big tech firms also have a huge role that they can play by advancing something called decentralized finance. These are tools that are backed by a technology called, a lot of people call it blockchain, that allows for very secure transactions. And potentially, these tools can provide low cost access to financial services anywhere around the world using a cell phone, which is super important, especially for low income groups that may not have access to more traditional banking or even broadband in order to plug into financial services. A fourth recommendation is government. Certainly, the US government has a huge role to play in terms of providing guardrails or light regulations for the use of these types of technologies that big tech firms can offer, especially among less sophisticated investors. Then the fifth and final recommendation is the Federal Reserve can actually explore and potentially establish something called the central bank digital currency. And this central bank digital currency can very much act like a checking account. It's going to provide if it provides sufficient privacy protocols, then many people can tap into this. It would be safe, inexpensive, and easy access to financial services for the underbanked and all Americans.
Well, that's fascinating, Dana. So, a lot of work to be done, but a lot of opportunities to be seized as well. And for our listeners, we will be publishing a paper on this that goes into detail. But you said something fascinating about, more people have access to a phone perhaps than have access to a bank in these communities. And the opportunities are about tapping into the zeitgeist. So, Denise, in the age of kind of self-expression on steroids, the zeitgeist that we're living at the moment, what does our survey highlight for how ethnicity impacts people's choices around the products and the services they have in order to express themselves?
Sure, yeah, really interesting topic because people express themselves in all kinds of ways. Just think of outfits, tattoos, smartwatches. People carry around reusable bottles, or they talk about their fitness habits, diet routines, and so forth. And even by patronizing or boycotting brands that represent their social and political values. So it's super interesting. And of course, people do that to differentiate themselves. And especially minority groups do that often to communicate, their and display their unique identity. Like, think of communities like the LGBTQ community or feminists. We have seen Black Lives Matter movements, not just in the US, but even around the world, or immigrant communities, not just in the US, but around the world. There is in many countries there are China towns, in certain cities, but also you find Indian, Latin American communities, Somali communities, Turkish, and so forth in many different geographies. So in our survey, we found that people actually use a variety of services categories to express their ethnic heritage. And the leading categories are discretionary services. So number one is actually these digital communication services, and that includes your cable subscriptions, streaming services. Think of all the content that can be shown, which can be ethnic in nature. And so maybe no surprise that ended up as being the number one, but also services like restaurants, travel, personal care services, and out-of-home entertainment. But even, the interesting thing is to, what Dana talked about, financial services, even these less visible services, such as financial services, health, education, and even household services, are used by almost like 40% of people in our sample to express themselves ethnically. And what the survey also found was that it's especially non-white consumers and the younger ones in particular that want to express themselves. What we saw in terms of age was also really interesting. There is certainly a generational shift going on. So younger Asian and white consumers, for example, they want to express their racial identity much more than their elder peers. And that might be due to, younger people being inspired by the people around them, who are increasingly diverse. So everybody sort of wants to express themselves as well. And of course, for the younger white consumers, the question is, since they used to be in the majority, so maybe they didn't have as much of a need to express themselves. But now the question becomes, what is white culture? So that will be an interesting, question to observe going forward. In terms of income, we found that it's overall the higher income groups that express themselves through services, especially Black and Latino consumers in income groups above $75,000 per year, which is slightly above the median income in the US. And this could be because, these populations have more discretionary funds to spend money on things to express themselves. And interestingly, in contrast to, Black and Latino consumers, Asian consumers in these higher age groups, they express their ethnic heritage less through services. So in terms of overall takeaways for companies here, as a services firm, you can think about how to leverage this as an opportunity for the business by designing the products and services and the customer experience to help customers express their ethnicity. Of course, there are some tricky issues to navigate. Like if you cater to a variety of customers, how do you sort of keep everybody happy and cater to their needs? And so also in terms of future planning, so in companies plan for the future, they consider demographics. And so in addition to considering age, a really important factor in these demographic shifts to consider is race and ethnicity, because as I mentioned, that is changing radically very fast in the US. And this issue or this topic of self-expression that might just be getting stronger in the Western world, because there are so many social trends, like there's more anonymized living in urban places, a growing urbanization in general, and also less in-person interaction, also fostered by more remote work. So people, there are maybe fewer opportunities for people to express themselves. So this might be getting more relevant, and even not just in the US, but around the world when you think of all the migration that is going on. And so there is more mixing of people in all kinds of places.
So mixing of people in all kinds of places, but for anybody interested in engaging with their customer and their consumer, age and income always, but this rising notion of the identity, especially expressed through ethnicity. But we have to stay timely and topical as well. So we have to acknowledge that that discretionary income that when we were doing our survey was there is now starting to decline. So Dana, as pressure increases on people's money, when you think about what Denise has just told us about how businesses can use ethnic heritage to tap into consumers and resonate with them, what do businesses need to think about in serving multicultural consumers in particular?
Certainly, we all know that prices are rising seemingly for everything, for goods, for services, for housing. But in particular, for services, prices are rising even faster relative to goods. Services include things that people do in person, for example, going to restaurants, or going to the movie theater, or going out to the mall, going to the ball game, those kinds of things, or even travel, hotels. and adventures, that sort of thing. Nonetheless, people are still interested in engaging in these types of activities, certainly as the pandemic is being placed into the rearview mirror. So the fact that people are facing higher prices and their discretionary income is being eaten up by having to focus on buying food and gasoline and paying the rent or the mortgage, it's very important that businesses really target what different groups are desiring in terms of services. Again, going back to the financial services, for example, making more money was very important to Asian consumers in the survey. Meanwhile, for Black consumers, they were very much focused on furthering their educations as well as furthering the educations of their children. So these are all things that businesses can think about and tap into in order to draw consumers to actually open up their wallets and spend on these discretionary types of items. So again, really marketing properly and going at the goals, thinking about what people's goals are in terms of what they desire to get out of life, what's their American dream mean, and then making sure that your marketing is addressing finding solutions and opportunities for those dreams.
That's lovely. What is their particular American dream? So I think that, we have to take into account as marketers and communicators the understanding of each individual and what's special for them and how we make our business, our service, or our offer equally appropriate to capture that special point of view. So listen, thank you very much. We're fielding more research, as Denise mentioned. This will get into slightly meatier topics, especially around inflation and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and even tap into how different people think about the geopolitical situation around the war in the Ukraine. Also on June the 9th, we'll be hosting a webcast that gives you the early results for our members, the early results of that survey. And we'll be posting the research, the in-depth detail, and the executive summary. Again, members only. That will be accessible on our website. But thank you very much to our chief economist, Dana Peterson, and to our senior researcher, Denise Dahlhoff. America is changing, and businesses need to change the way they think about what it means to be an American and how you market to a multicultural America. Thank you very much. We'll see you at the next episode of Influencers.
This has been Influencers from the Conference Board.